There is a story written in mud, pulled from the deep floor of the Gulf of Oman. It is a story told by dust. For thousands of years, layer settled upon layer, dark bands for wet seasons, pale bands for dry. But around 4,200 years ago, the pale bands thicken. A surge of dust, ground from the highlands of Mesopotamia, blows out over the water for nearly 300 years. It is an obituary, written by the wind, for the world's first empire. At the very same time this dust layer forms, the Akkadian Empire, a sprawling power that had seemed invincible, comes apart at the seams. Its cities shrink, its northern fields turn to steppe, and its capital, the legendary city of Akkad, vanishes so completely from history that to this day we have never found it. How does a power that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, that commanded thousands of soldiers, that rewrote the rules of civilization, simply blow away? The answer lies where the dust begins, on the parched fields and in the abandoned cities of Mesopotamia. Before Akkad, there was Sargon. His story begins in legend. A baby set adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates, rescued and raised by a gardener. But the man who emerged from this humble story around 2334 BCE was anything but humble. He was a political and military genius. The land was a patchwork of Sumerian city-states in the south, each with its own king, its own god, its own army. They had warred and allied for centuries. Sargon, an Akkadian speaker from the central Mesopotamian city of Kish, did what no one before him had truly managed. He conquered them all. He defeated the great king of Uruk, Lugal-Zaggisi, and washed his weapons in the waters of the Persian Gulf to symbolize the totality of his victory. But conquest was the easy part. Holding it was the true challenge. Sargon created a new model for power. This was not just a collection of conquered cities, it was an integrated state, the first true multi-ethnic empire in history. He installed his own trusted Akkadian governors in the old Sumerian capitals, bypassing local loyalties. He standardized weights, measures, and even the calendar to knit his diverse realm together. To enforce his will, Sargon built a new kind of army. Later traditions speak of a standing force of 5,400 soldiers who ate bread before him daily. This was revolutionary. Instead of relying on seasonal levies of farmers, Sargon maintained a professional, loyal corps that could move fast and strike hard. This army was the fist of the empire, but its nervous system was made of clay. Akkadian, Sargon's Semitic tongue, became the language of administration, spreading through a network of scribes. On tens of thousands of clay tablets, they tracked everything: taxes paid in barley, rations for canal diggers, troop movements, and land surveys. These tablets, recovered from the sands of Iraq and Syria, let us hear the hum of a complex bureaucratic machine. To bind the empire's soul, Sargon made a brilliant political move. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, the most sacred city of the Sumerians he had conquered. Enheduanna was not just a priestess, she was a poet, the first named author in all of human history. In her powerful hymns, she skillfully wove the Akkadian gods together with the Sumerian pantheon, creating a shared religious ideology that made Akkadian rule feel like part of the cosmic order. The empire reached its dazzling height under Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, who reigned from around 2254 BCE. He was even more ambitious than his grandfather. He pushed the empire's borders to their greatest extent and adopted a title of breathtaking arrogance: King of the Four Quarters, essentially King of the known world. But then he went a step further, doing something no Mesopotamian ruler had ever dared. He had himself declared a living god, with his name written with the divine determinative, the cuneiform sign for a deity. This supreme confidence is immortalized in stone. His Victory Stele, a 2-meter-high masterpiece now in the Louvre, shows him as a giant, muscular figure with a horned helmet, the traditional headgear of the gods. He strides triumphantly up a mountain, trampling the bodies of his enemies, the Lulubi people of the Zagros Mountains. His soldiers gaze up at him in adoration. Above, celestial bodies shine their approval. The message was clear. Naram-Sin was not merely a king, he was divine. His victory was cosmically ordained, and his empire was meant to be eternal. It was an ideology that must have seemed unshakable, fed by a steady stream of grain from the rain-fed fields of the north flowing south to the great cities, and by tribute from lands as far as the shores of the Mediterranean. But the empire's foundation was more fragile than it appeared. Its northern provinces, the vast plains of the Habur Triangle in modern Syria, were its breadbasket. Unlike the south, which relied on complex irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates, the north depended on one thing: rain. And around 2200 BCE, the rains began to fail. This wasn't a single bad harvest. It was a prolonged, punishing aridification that scientists now call the 4.2 kiloyear event. The evidence is global. In caves in Oman, the chemical signature in stalagmites shows a sudden drop in monsoon moisture. In lakebeds across the Near East, pollen counts shift from farmland grains to desert scrub. And in the Gulf of Oman, that thick layer of Mesopotamian dust appears in the sediment cores. For the people on the ground, this meant fields turning to cracked earth. It meant dust storms choking the sky for weeks on end. It meant the grain stores, the lifeblood of the empire's rationing system, began to empty. The most haunting proof comes from the ruins of Tell Leilan, a major Akkadian administrative center in the northern breadbasket. Around 2200 BCE, its bustling public buildings were abandoned. Archaeologists found a distinct layer of fine, wind-blown dust lying directly on top of the swept floors. It is a literal dust line in history. Below it, the artifacts of a thriving bureaucracy. Above it, nothing but sterile grit. The administrative tablets, the records of grain and labor, simply stop. The silence is absolute. As the north withered, the empire's economic map was violently redrawn. Desperate, starving populations abandoned their villages and began to move south, seeking refuge in the irrigated lands along the great rivers. This mass migration placed unbearable strain on the southern cities. The flow of tax grain from the north ceased, and soon the central government couldn't pay its soldiers or feed its administrators. The divine king suddenly looked powerless. Naram-Sin's successor, Shar-kali-sharri, who ascended the throne around 2217 BCE, inherited a crumbling world. His name meant king of all kings, but he ruled over an empire in revolt. He spent his entire reign racing from one crisis to the next, putting down rebellions in the south while fending off raids in the north. The very mountains where Naram-Sin had celebrated his divine victory now sent a new threat. Groups from the Zagros highlands, known in the texts as the Gutians, began to raid deeper and deeper into the weakened lowlands. Where Naram-Sin's stele showed an Akkadian god ascending into the mountains, the reality was now mountain peoples descending onto the plains. The image had been inverted. The collapse on the ground was a slow process of absence. It was a caravan that never arrived, a canal that silted up for lack of maintenance, a scribal school with shuttered doors. The great imperial machine ground to a halt. Authority fractured, and local warlords re-emerged from the rubble, carving out their own small kingdoms. Centuries later, Mesopotamian poets tried to explain the catastrophe in a story called The Curse of Akkad. They blamed Naram-Sin's hubris. In their telling, the king sacked a holy temple, and the enraged gods unleashed 7 plagues upon the land: famine, drought, and chaos. It was a myth, but it was a myth that preserved the memory of a real trauma. The story's description of silent cities and fields covered in dust perfectly matches the archaeological record. The greatest mystery, however, is the fate of Akkad itself. We know it was the empire's heart, a fabulously wealthy capital, yet its location is a ghost. Despite a century of searching, no archaeologist has ever definitively identified its ruins. The empire's administrative fingerprints are everywhere, on tablets found hundreds of kilometers apart, but the center from which all those orders came remains lost to the dust. The irony is staggering. The paperwork outlived the palace. The idea of empire, however, did not die. After a period of chaos, a new power arose in the south, the Third Dynasty of Ur. They initiated a Sumerian renaissance, but they built their new state on the old Akkadian scaffolding of provincial governors, standardized accounting, and centralized control. The first empire was gone, but the template it created would be used by every ambitious Mesopotamian king for the next 2,000 years. Akkad taught the world how to build an empire, and its fall provided an even more enduring lesson: that no structure, no matter how divine its king or how powerful its army, is immune to the pressures of a changing world. Sometimes, the loudest story is told by a thin layer of dust. If you enjoy clear journeys through the rise and fall of old powers, subscribe and stick with Dustkings. There are more empires, more choices, and more endings on the channel. Drop a like if this story clicked for you, and we will see you in the next ruin. Until then, travel well in the past.